Hi, and welcome to Whisky Shorts, where we look at the moments, the events, and the characters that have defined the story of Scotch whisky and have certainly added to its rich cultural heritage. And today we turn the clock back to the year 1690 and the rather quirky anomaly of the Ferintosh Privilege. Whisky making was widespread across the Scottish Highlands of the 17th century, a sort of background noise that echoed across moor and glen from farm to castle. It's very small scale in operation, a domestic enterprise mainly for personal consumption, and what little extra made would have been sold at local markets to earn the family maybe a few extra shillings. Life was tough in the 17th century. The Highlands are a tough place to eke out a living. It's a wild environment, it takes no prisoners, and farming was the mainstay of a subsistence economy with no safety net. One bad harvest and things could go south pretty quickly. And that little whisky made could be the difference between seeing it through the winter or not. Now, barley is just about the only grain that can cope with the geography and the climate of the Highlands. And after harvesting, the crop you had would be milled, and some of it would go for flour for bread making, some would be used to pay rents, some would be the seed for the following season, and some you would keep for the many rainy days ahead. Now, grain will be dried so it will not rot in the barn, but you could brew it into an ale, which many did, but you need to drink this pretty quickly as well before it too went mouldy, especially in the summer. So distilling into a spirit would keep longer, and thus it could be used either to, well, knock you into next week, or to trade at market and pay rents. It had a commercial value. Now, no tax was payable on whisky made in tiny amounts for private use, but it was levied on any sold for commercial grain, especially as new markets were growing in the lowlands and around Inverness and Aberdeen. However, in the Highlands, which was impossible to police thanks to its geography, enforcement of those duties was virtually non-existent. The 17th century in Scotland was also pretty volatile politically, which would have deep ramifications in the north. In 1685, the popular king, Charles II, died, and he was succeeded by his feckless brother, James VII II. Now, James was hot-headed, irrational, politically unstable, and way out of his depth as king. But perhaps worst of all, he had converted to the Catholic faith. Scotland and England were both entrenched Protestant nations, devoutly so, and they were deeply suspicious, hateful even, towards Catholicism, or popery as it was called. And so this was a political and religious time bomb ticking away. However, James was already in his 50s, and he had two Protestant daughters in Mary and Anne, who actually hated each other. And the eldest, Mary, was married to the Protestant champion, William of Orange, the stadholder of Holland. It seemed the Protestant succession thus was secure. However, James remarried, and in 1688 his wife gave birth to a baby son, Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. Now, as a boy, he immediately jumped the order of succession, and in doing so, confirmed and secured the Catholic legacy. This was more than the establishment in England could cope with. So Parliament wrote to William and Mary, inviting them to come to England and usurp James from the throne. William, James's nephew, and his son-in-law had qualms, but his daughter Mary did not, and they landed on the south coast of England with 25,000 men. They had been promised the keys to London, where the red carpet would be awaiting. It wasn't quite like that, but William took the throne from his uncle without a shot being fired, and James and his family fled to France and into permanent exile. It was known as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary were crowned joint king and queen, and in Scotland a year later, in 1689, the Parliament in Edinburgh agreed to accept the couple as well, and they were invested as the Scottish monarchs. Now, not everybody in Scotland was happy about this, in particular in the Highlands and the Northeast, where there was a strong, loyal support to the exiled king, and they took their name from the Latin for James, Jacobus, and called themselves the Jacobites. The Jacobites were led by the mercurial, if rather ill-fated commander, John Graham of Claverhouse, and they won a spectacular victory at the Battle of Killiecrankie in the July of 1689. But Claverhouse was killed during the fighting, legend has it, by a silver bullet in the very last moment of the battle. And so while victorious, the Jacobites would be defeated a fortnight later at Dunkeld, and the campaign slid into a sort of guerrilla effort until James himself was beaten on the Boyne in Ireland the following year. The Jacobites also employed a scorched earth policy against any and all supporters of King William, leaving especial vengeance and venom for those who did so in the Highlands. One such supporter was the successful lawyer and landowner Duncan Forbes of Culloden, laird to the Ferintosh Estates on the Black Isle to the north of Inverness. Now, while Forbes was away in Holland raising money and troops to support the new king, the Jacobites harried his lands and burnt his crops, destroying his houses and his distilleries, putting them completely out of action. And when he returned, he went to the Scottish Parliament and asked for compensation for loss of property and income. And he cited that he was out of the country working on behalf of the king, and the officials agreed, and they suggested a sum of £4,000 compensation. He accepted, but while he had them, he also demanded that he should be able to rebuild his distilleries and that he could make and sell his whisky tax-free for a fixed annual payment of around £5. The government agreed to this also. Forbes distilleries had been an important part of the farming economy of the region, so this would be locally beneficial. It all pretty much made sense. He then secured the deal in perpetuity for his descendants, and quite staggeringly, the government agreed to this as well. It was a spectacular coup, and Forbes immediately began erecting distilleries. It was known as the Ferintosh Privilege. By the 1730s, Ferintosh, with maybe as many as 29 distilleries, was producing around half of all the whisky sold in Scotland and beyond. Their only real competition came from the new, large lowland distilleries, such as owned by the Haigs and its Steens at Kennetpans, Kilbaggy, and Lochran in Edinburgh. Highland whisky had to be fired by peat, which is a slow burn, low octane fuel, and so by necessity, the stills were small and run slowly. The lowland stills, by comparison, were huge, maybe 100 times bigger, and they were fueled by coal or coke, and they were run much faster. They had a lot of output, but the cost was quality. It was low-grade moonshine. But the slow-made Ferintosh whiskies took more time, but they were heavier and contained much more flavour. And even with the higher transportation costs, the tax exemption allowed the Forbes family to compete with the big boys in the south. And most of their spirit was actually being sent to London for rectification into gin. So quality for the Haigs and Steens wasn't a concern. But on their own doorsteps, in places like Glasgow or Perth, consumers preferred and indeed demanded the better Highland juice coming out of Ferintosh. It all came to an end with William Pitt and the Wash Act of 1784. He completely restructured, indeed created to a certain extent, the modern whisky industry. And that meant in with the new, out with the old. And it was the end, by law, of the Ferintosh Privilege. Forbes, who was the Lord Advocate, and the British government came to an arrangement, and the Treasury bought the family out for £21,000, which is £3 million today, give or take. Now, Forbes was not really interested in whisky making, and now with the cash cow gone, he kind of gave up on his distilleries as well, and the last of them would close in the 1830s. Yet for 100 years, this tiny estate in the Scottish Highlands furnished the taverns the length and breadth of Scotland their good quality whisky without a single ounce of tax being paid. The Ferintosh Privilege is a forgotten part of our story, a wonderful narrative within the grand scheme of the history of Scotch whisky. Thank you very much for listening.